Good morning, everyone. Good morning, and welcome back to our final installment of the series that we've been doing this fall, Voices of the Church, a journey with the fathers and doctors. So here we are at the end, and just to sort of give you a recap, I do want to tell everyone that in case you've missed any of the installments and want to go back and look at them, you can find them still on the Cathedral Facebook page. If you go to across the menu at the top and you go to videos and you click that, it'll bring up all the videos that have been shared via live stream, including these talks. Obviously, all the masses are there as well. And if you go to the Cathedral website, to the Education tab now, and I know this because we just updated this last week, if you go to the Adult Faith Formation page, you can find all the videos for fall up through last week. And actually, you can find videos from, I think, going back now 3 or 4 years, in case you really, like you're really bored and you want to go back and look at old material. It's all up there as well. Today, we're going to conclude by looking at the lives of the 2 remaining female doctors of the church. Saint Therese of Lisieux, also known as Saint Therese of the Child Jesus, also known as Saint Therese of the Holy Face, also known as Saint Therese of the Little Flower. She's got a really wonderful, sweet story, and Dottie and I were just speaking before we started today about how I feel like she's a personality that I feel like we would be naturally attracted to if we knew her. She's a very sweet, sweet spirit. And also then we'll be looking at St. Hildegard of Bingen, who is, and these women, as I said earlier, I hope they forgive me, because they could not be more different. To put these 2 together is almost kind of a study in contrast. But this is actually the order in which they were named doctors of the church. The way we've looked at these, although we did St. Catherine of Siena before we did St. Teresa of Avila, remember they were actually named together as the first female doctors of the church in 1970 by Pope St. Paul VI. And I placed them in that order because St. Catherine of Siena was 14th century and St. Teresa of Avila was 16th century. So today we're actually doing them in the order in which they were named doctors, because St. Therese was named first in 1997, and then St. Hildegard is the most recent one. She was named in 2012. So they lived 700 years apart. 700 years apart. They inhabited very different temporal realms, very different times. One of them was born into a very modern world, a post-revolutionary Europe of the late 19th century, where you have the separation of church and state that's very well established. Those boundaries are very neatly drawn. And then you have one of them born at the height of the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, actually, during a time when the church was at its peak of temporal and spiritual power. The medieval church was a real force to be reckoned with in the secular sense as well. So these women inhabited very, very different worlds. As a matter of fact, during the time that St. Hildegard lived, and she was born in the late 11th century, during the time that she lived, more often than not only were church and state not separated, you couldn't separate the concepts of church and state, much less the institutions. The state, more often than not, was subject to the church. So these are 2 very different times. And both of them, though, both of these women, both religious women, obviously, living the principles of the same universal faith across these 7 centuries, living the same principles with the same eternal truths of the same universal faith. A study in contrast, as I said, in many ways, I think, but proof. I see this as proof of the eternal nature of the truth of what we profess today as 21st century Christians. These women would be right at home with us today in this room. maybe a little bit put off by our technologies, or in the case of St. Hildegard, perhaps a little bit, or in the case of both of them, a little bit stumped by our language, but they would certainly feel very much at home, I think, with the truth that we profess as Christians today. And it goes back to that whole thing that's underpinned all of this, which is the timelessness of all of these people and their writings, and across time and place. Both of them, obviously, as I said, both of them, well, clearly both of them women, both of them religious, both nuns, one a Carmelite and one a Benedictine. Both of them sought sanctity, but in very different ways. They both made humility a model for all of us, and obviously both of them are recognized by the church for their great contributions to the rest of us. St. Therese, who lived from 1873 to 1897, she was just 24 years old when she died. Well, she was canonized in 1925. I want you to think about this timeline. Canonized. She became a saint in 1925, just 28 years after her death. And, you know, it is not, actually it's more the norm, that sometimes it takes decades to be venerable, beatified, but it can take centuries to be canonized. It's not really a record. I mean, obviously we can think of some contemporary, in our own lifetime, people that have been elevated to sainthood happened very quickly for. Pope St. John Paul II, for instance. Mother Teresa, obviously, is another example of that. But this is certainly a very fast track. 28 years was very fast track. Pope Pius XI canonized her. And in 1997, it was Pope St. John Paul II who made her a doctor of the church. So, Hildegard of Bingen, who lived from 1098 to 1197, is that right? 1187. She's 81. 1187, I suppose. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can tell I was a liberal arts major, can't you? She's made a doctor of the church in 2012 by Pope Benedict XVI. And what they have in common, again, is their faith. Their faith. Although they have very different methods and very different personalities, which actually makes them interesting to look at together, I think. St. Therese was interested in a truly simple way. A simple way. A way so simple that it's actually quite profound. And in that it is something that I think eludes most of us, most of the time. St. Hildegard had a mystical way that she followed. As a matter of fact, she's probably one of the single greatest of the high medieval mystics. In practice, that mysticism that she was drawn to is also something that would elude the modern or postmodern mind, I think, just as much as St. Therese and her little simple way. We are approaching these, as I said, in the chronological order that they became doctors, not the order in which they lived. So we look to St. Therese first. Her autobiographical work, or a portion of it, is included in the reader, the story of a soul. And has anybody read any of it yet? It's a very simple read, very easy to read, very straightforward. It is only a portion. Obviously, we did not include the her entire autobiography in the reader. And I'll speak more to that so when we talk about some of what took place as the sisters in her community knew that she was dying. Kind of what took place regarding her writings. I think it's kind of interesting. To segue from the woman we talked about last week, St. Teresa of Avila, remember we talked about St. Teresa of Avila and her reforming of the Carmelite order. It's really one of the big marks that she left on church history, was her zeal for reforming, cleaning up the act, if you will, of that order, and founding many, I think 17 in all, reformed convents across the Iberian Peninsula before she died in 1582. So to kind of make a connection back to her, St. Therese is also a Carmelite. And she, of course, by the time that she lived in the late 19th century, the reforms of St. Teresa of Avila were well in place and well known. It's interesting that these two doctors of the church, St. Teresa and St. Therese, have that link in common. I mentioned that St. Therese is also known as St. Therese of the Child Jesus, St. Therese of the Holy Face, St. Therese of the Little Flower. So we're going to talk about what all those things mean. And more popularly, of course, probably today, the way you most often see her referred to is St. Therese, the Little Flower. That's how you usually see her referred to. Her brief life, 24 years, was punctuated by the development of a deep but very simple pattern of devotion that is a model for everyone. In fact, her little way is what she is best known for. And I'll go ahead and tell you that I think that she makes an interesting meditation for the current times we live in. Because it is reading her and especially what she has to say about living a cloistered lifestyle, living an isolated lifestyle, and what impact could she possibly make on the world basically in solitary confinement, I think speaks to us in our contemporary time. If we are tempted to think that maybe what we're doing right now doesn't matter, she's a reminder that it all matters. Every little thing matters. Before she died from tuberculosis, at the age of 24, she had already been a Carmelite for 9 years. She entered the order at the age of 15. And her spirituality had run the gamut from this great, and you can see it in her autobiography if you read it in its entirety, from this great and very intense feeling that Christ was present and near to her all the time, to prolonged periods of doubt. She had both of those in a very short, brief life. And this is, of course, what her story of a soul is about that's in the reader. She described her life as, quote, the little way of spiritual childhood. And I don't want to quote her because I think having them speak to us is better than probably anything I can say about what she said. Quote, what matters in life is not great deeds, but great love. Therese lived and taught this spirituality of attending to everyone and everything well, no matter how small it was, no matter how small the task, but to do it with great love. She believed that just as a child becomes enamored, I know we've all been around toddlers, how a child becomes enamored with one little thing, and in that moment is so completely enraptured by it, that really constitutes the sum total of their existence. Been with a child that's done this. And to be living in the moment is what she's making reference to here. We should all have this childlike focus and this totally attentive love in the moment with whatever that is. Her spirituality is of doing the ordinary, the simple, the small things. She never went on missions. She never founded a religious order. She didn't, like St. Catherine of Siena or St. Teresa of Avila, write these great theological texts. She didn't leave behind this great legacy of mysticism. And I think she would say, if she were here today, she would say she never performed great works. But her simplicity was her greatness. Always the little way. Her parents, I think, also merit a mention here in their own right. Zélie and Louis Martin, her parents. So she's born in Alençon in France, and her parents were both quite devout. Her mother was known to say, again, as a teenager herself, her mother was known to say that she wanted to live to be a saint. That was her life's goal, was to become a saint. She became a very successful a lace maker, so much so that her husband quit his job. Imagine that. Her husband quit his job because to help her with her business, basically took over managing the financial end of her business. And of course, she did eventually become a saint. I'll talk about that in a minute. But her father actually apparently had been in discernment to enter religious life too. He wanted to be a monk. And so when they got married, they were going to be celibate. And their parish priest apparently told them that's not how marriage works. You know, if you're going to marry and that's your vocation, that's not how it works. So they went on to have 9 children. So I guess, okay, I'll keep this PG rated, but obviously you see they figured that out. And of those 9 children, 5 of them lived to adulthood. One of them, of course, Therese. So her parents, Zélie and Louis, were canonized together in 2015 by Pope Francis, the first and only married couple to ever become saints together like this. Their role in Therese's life is that well documented. Their own lives models of sanctity and holiness, and great models for all of us as well. And although their lives are, as I said, a bit beyond our purview, I do think that their stories are quite interesting to go look at in their own right. Saint Therese, like Saint Teresa of Avila, again, here's another connection we can make. She lost her mother at a very young age. Saint Therese's mother, Zélie, died when Therese was only 4 years old. She died of breast cancer, apparently. And Therese herself suffered from very poor health almost her entire life. As a matter of fact, when she was an infant, her parents were uncertain that she was going to survive. And this was not, again, not necessarily that uncommon still in the 19th century for children to die in infancy or childhood. But she was certainly in poor health. We had that from the first 2 years of her life, that she didn't even live with her parents for much of that time because they wanted her living in healthier conditions. She suffered throughout her life from various maladies, and we're not really clear what all of those were, but she was just never very strong physically. Her strength was, like so many of these people we've looked at, her strength was always spiritual. She had a vision of the Virgin Mary during one of these bouts of illness as a child, something that apparently she reported to many people, and no one believed her. At least from the sounds of the accounts of this, no one believed her. At 15, as I said, she entered the Carmelite order, heavily influenced by the reading of an important work that I could commend to anybody that hasn't already read it. Anybody ever read The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis? Yeah, it's a great spiritual work of the late Middle Ages. She read that, she was profoundly influenced by it, and she seems to have intuitively known that she wasn't going to live long. She once said, and I'm going to quote her again, "Love proves itself by deeds. So how am I to show my love? Great deeds are forbidden me." Now what she means is she's obviously living in a cloistered environment. That's what she means. Great deeds are forbidden me. The only way I can prove my love is by scattering flowers. And these flowers are every little sacrifice, every glance and word, and the doing of the least actions. And she took every chance in her religious life from 15 to 24. She seems to have taken every chance to do this. In her words, always looking for what she could sacrifice. And even in her life in this order, it's recounted by her sister, and she remained a novice, by the way, the entire time, seeing that as an exercise in humility. She reported, I'm not sure this is in her autobiography or if this is in a secondary account, but that she, for instance, was one time accused of something in the order that she didn't do. And she took responsibility for it and asked forgiveness. She was always finding the small way of sacrificing herself to something bigger, a bigger principle, the community. And this is why the story about the flowers, her use of this metaphor of using her deeds as flowers, of scattering flowers, is why she has become known as the little flower, and her simple spirituality as the little way. And I don't know, anybody in here, or anybody watching, you could maybe email me and share this with me, anybody ever done the novena to St. Therese? Did you get flowers? See the flowers? This is a very commonly reported thing, that people who do a novena, who ask for her intercession, have this appearance of flowers in their lives quite unexpectedly. Our own Pope, Pope Francis, of course, reports this frequently, that he has an ongoing friendship with St. Therese. So I want to quote her again here. She said, "I have always wanted to become a saint. Unfortunately, when I have compared myself with the saints, I have always found that there is the same difference between the saints and me as there is between a mountain whose summit is lost in the clouds and a humble grain of sand trodden underfoot by passers-by. Instead of being discouraged, I tell myself, God would not make me wish for something impossible. So in spite of my littleness, I will aim at being a saint. Since it is impossible for me to grow bigger, I put up with myself as I am, with all my countless faults. But I will look for some means of going to heaven by a little way which is very, very straight, a little way that will seem quite new." So that's almost prophetic to us, because of course that's exactly what happens. It's exactly what she became known for and recognized for. And I want to talk, I also want to take the opportunity, because that's what she's, of course, most well known for, is the little way and her association with the flowers. But I do want to talk about something, an aspect of her life that is, I think, it's not going to surprise you. It's an aspect of her sanctity that is of considerable interest to me, if you know anything about me and my interest. And you can look behind me on the wall and see what one of those things is. There's an aspect of her personal sanctity and her personal devotion, piety, that she had a devotion to the holy face of Jesus. Now, to put this in some context, well, remember the years that she lives, 1873 to 1897. So the first photograph of the cloth, known to us as the Shroud of Turin, was not taken until 1898, the year after she died. So it's not until 1898 that we know the complexity of the image that's there and the fullness of the facial features, which, remember, are revealed in the photographic negative, which is actually the positive. But so she wouldn't have known this devotion. But the devotion to the holy face of Jesus technically begins among the Carmelites in the 1840s. It began in that order. It was based on the image of the face of Christ on the veil of Veronica. This original devotion was, rather than the Shroud of Turin. So she was familiar with this devotion because it was in her order. And later, when she took her vows, she took the name Therese of the Child Jesus. That's when she entered religious life. That's what her name was. And then later she added of the Holy Face, because this became such a part of her personal piety. In her poem that she wrote called My Heaven Down Here, which was composed 2 years before she died in 1895, she talks about this devotion to the Holy Face, and she makes the comparison between the union of her own soul and that of Christ by meditating on his physical body, the incarnation itself. By meditating on his holy face, she felt that divine union of love. So this was a very important part of her personal piety. So it's said that when she really fostered this devotion, not just for her, but among others in her convent, that she made a small card, attached a stamp to it that had the face of the Holy Face on it, and she inscribed the words, "Make me resemble you, Jesus," and she folded it and wore it in a locket over her heart. And sometimes she would even pin this on the outside of her habit. In future years, her poems, the remaining 2 years of her life, she wrote a lot of poetry. Her poems and prayers helped spread this devotion to the Holy Face. And then beyond her life, the influence of this. And this is where I really get interested in the story, is because beyond her life, when she died in 1897, as I said, the world was a year away, 1898, from the very first time that an amateur photographer photographed this cloth and realized the complexity of the image that's there, the detail of the face itself. That face, the face of Seconda Pia's photograph, spread across the world like wildfire, as you can imagine. And with it, because of the proximity of this photograph to her death and her own devotion to the Holy Face, so does that devotion. That devotion spread very rapidly around the world. And then in 1935, sort of put the footnote on the story, in 1935, there was another nun, not a Carmelite, unfortunately, that would have made the story too convenient, but another religious sister, Marie Pyrina was her name. She had a vision of the Holy Face, and in this vision that she had, she was urged to develop a medal using the image of the face that she saw, which incidentally is the face of the shroud, Turin. And I don't know how many of you know this. Sister Faustina, do you know this in her vision of divine mercy? That the vision of the face of Jesus that she saw has been analyzed and has like 100 points of congruity to this one, which is really fascinating too. But so this image that Marie Pyrina had, this vision that she had, became the foundation, the basis of the official Vatican-approved devotion to the Holy Face, which came about because of Pope Pius XII, who formally declared the Feast of the Holy Face in 1958. And it's not really one of those feasts that's universally celebrated, but it is particularly in Europe, especially in Italy. It is always observed. And the medal that was approved by the Vatican is based on this vision that she had, as well as the words that she received in that vision. Marie Pyrina now received in that vision, based on Psalm 62. Quote, "May, O Lord, the light of thy countenance shine upon us," and on the reverse, "Stay with us, O Lord." So I actually wear one around my wrist, the Vatican-approved medal that has the Holy Face and that inscription that was approved by Pope Pius XII. But what's interesting about this is a devotion that really can be traced to Saint Therese. A year before the world saw this face, when she died, she was already promoting this devotion throughout her own order, her own small, little, as she would say, sphere of influence. She was already doing that. So I think that's just really fascinating. Her brief life of poor health took a very dramatic turn. One day in 1896, when she must have known she was mortally ill because she began coughing up copious amounts of blood. And we know this only because her sister, not just her religious sister, but her biological sister, reported it that she knew that she was ill, very ill, and she told no one. She kept working for the next year until she became so sick that everyone knew it and she could no longer hide it. But during that last year of her life, the order, her community encouraged her to continue writing as much as she could, believing that her work was going to be important. And so that they would have something to circulate about her life when she died. So right before her death, she is reported to have said to her sisters that were with her, "My heaven," and I love this, Dottie and I were talking about this before, "my heaven will be spent on earth, doing small things for others." And this is, of course, why the devotion to her is so popular. This is why the novena to her is so popular. She died on September 30th, 1897, at the age of just 24. And her sisters, fortunately, they encouraged her to continue writing, and they gathered together her poetry, and they gathered together her autobiography that was written in journal segments across a span of several years. Fortunately, they did that. Unfortunately, they seem to have heavily edited some of them. But they sent hundreds of copies of her autobiography to other convents and encouraging this little way of hers. And as I said, not only did it spread throughout the Carmelite order, but then spread beyond its borders into mainstream Christianity, so that by 1925, she was canonized. 28 years. Just 28 years after her death. I mentioned earlier, and this is kind of a personal note, but she reminds us that if any of us ever feel like we're in a situation where we can't do anything, I think that she reminds us that it is the little things that keep God's kingdom growing, that keep it going. It's in the moments, it's in the small things, it's in the maybe the simplest of encounters, the simplest of tasks, that we can do those things. I've been especially mindful of this during this time of COVID, when we have been limited and restricted in many ways. And again, I know that I'm sounding like I've got a song stuck on repeat by now, but her message is, what's the word? Timeless. It is timeless. It's truly, it spans the entirety of the faith. Her elevation to Doctor of the Church by Pope St. Paul II, Pope St. John Paul II in 1997 attests to that, because remember, that's one of the criteria for being a doctor, is that your writings, you have to produce writings that are significant, and you also have to have had a timeless impact on the faith. So, turning to look at really sort of a contrast to her, St. Hildegard of Bingen, the last woman to be named a Doctor of the Church. Remember, there's four of us so far, of 36. In 2012 she was named, so just 8 years ago. Yet she lived in the 12th century, and her story is kind of interesting because, and it might automatically, I think it's a fair question, why was she elevated to a Doctor of the Church in 2012? It was Pope Benedict XVI who did this. Why 2012? Why, if she's this great mystic, why not earlier? Why not, for instance, when we looked at St. Catherine of Siena and St. Therese of Avila, who she certainly would have been more in company with, what's going on? You know, I'm always interested in that. Because she does seem like somewhat of an isolated figure. As a matter of fact, and I remember this, when Pope Benedict XVI named her a Doctor of the Church in 2012, I had people in my academic community who asked me, who is she? Who? You know, if you said St. Catherine of Siena, everybody go, oh, okay, right? But who? Why? I mean, I remember hearing that. And of course, I knew of her. I knew of her mostly because of some correspondence that she'd written to a Holy Roman Emperor that I had encountered at one point in my studies. But I got it. I understood why people would say, well, why her? So it's really interesting why, and I think you'll see this. She lived during a time, as I said, when the church was at its height of power and influence over the secular world, over medieval society. The time she lived, think about this, she lived during the time of the Second and Third Crusades. She's living during the Crusade era. But yet she was a writer. She was a philosopher. She was a poet. She was an artist. She was a musician. And she was an abbess of a Benedictine community. She's a great mystic. She heavily influenced the medieval mysticism that in turn influenced the likes of St. Catherine of Siena and St. Therese of Avila. She was gifted with visions from a very young age, about the age of 3, according to most medieval chronicles of her life. And incidentally, there are many chronicles that she appears in, which is unusual for a woman of the 11th century. Her written accounts of her visions, which she gathered up and published, she published as something called Know the Ways. Know the Ways. Was in crude Latin, but she sent it to 2 people, to 2 men that she believed could help her spread this message of how to know the ways. She's referring to a mystical way. She sent it to Pope Blessed Eugene III, who was Pope at the time. Pope from 1145 to 1153, I believe. Not long, like 8 years. But he's a blessed because of his significant contributions. We could go off on a big rabbit trail there. But she sent them to Pope Blessed Eugene III, and she also sent them to someone you may have heard of, St. Bernard of Clairvaux. 2 men that she believed fiercely intellectual, that she kind of wanted to critique her work in many ways. And interestingly, the Pope found himself so inspired by her that he actually wrote back to her and encouraged her to continue writing, in personal note, encouraged her to continue writing, and she did, going on to produce a couple of other mystical works as well. The Book of the Merits of Life is one of them. The other one is called Divine Works. They're usually published in a trilogy together, those 3. And incidentally, these are also, you can find them in full text format online, completely free, in good English translations. Because her Latin was a little bit on the crude side, the translation into English has not always been as smooth as some of the other works that we looked at from like the great fathers of the early church. But they are available completely, as I said, full text format, completely free online. The copyright went off on 11th century works a long time ago, so they are freely available. But she also, as I said, she sent this work to St. Bernard of Clairvaux as well, wanting his critique. And again, they sort of began a correspondence over this as well. Chief among her visions, and I think this is what she's really known for, is that she saw human beings. She referred to this as the living light because of a vision that she had of the essence of God as pure light, and that she had this vision that this essence of light sent sparks into the entire universe, and that each one of us is a spark of light emitted from this great light, from a single bright source. And she says this is what we are. We are sparks of light. And that is her most common visual theme. If you read her, this comes up repeatedly. Her most common theme. We are all sparks of the eternal light. And that our physicality is just that. It's dying. From the moment that we come here, we're dying, she says, of course. That seems a rather obvious statement. But then she goes on to talk about the spark of the eternal within us as light. Lots of references to that. we have to acknowledge something here, and I'm going to wrap back around to what I said about my curiosity about her being elevated to Doctor of the Church in 2012. The reaction of many people I knew in academia who didn't even know who she was, church historians who were only vaguely aware of her. I think we have to acknowledge that without the diligent work of a lot of medieval scholars in the latter part of the 20th century, who are really responsible for bringing Hildegard's writings out of relative obscurity. I mentioned that the translations from the Latin, well, in fact, had never even been done. No one had attempted translation of her works out of Latin until the late 20th century. So she was known, but not in the broad sense of some other, obviously many of the other doctors of the church. But had it not been for this handful of scholars in the late 20th century that really promoted this, it's doubtful that she would have become a doctor of the church. Most of her works, as I said, I would dare say all of them had never been translated. Most of them, most of what she had written had probably not been read in several centuries. So, because of the era that her works became well known in, the mid to late 20th century, which, think about it, we've talked about this in here before, what's going on after the middle of the 20th century in intellectual endeavor, in the way that we think? We call it the age of postmodernism, right? There's a real shift in the way that we think. And because this is when her works are coming to light, scholars, many scholars who had perhaps never even heard of her before, were very quick to label her writings as feminist. As feminist. In a way that you do not find among other medieval female saints, for instance. And I think that to label her that way is anachronistic. She certainly would not have known that word. She wouldn't have known the meaning of that word. So to label her that way, I think, is anachronistic. But it does elevate sort of the awareness of her. At least in certain circles it did. The 20th century was the time, the late 20th century particularly, when gender and women's studies were becoming serious academic disciplines. I mean, every university in the world opened up a division within their Department of History or their Department of Humanities to look at gender studies or women's studies. And so she became a very popular topic for master's theses, for people who were studying church history and wanted to look at mysticism and writing doctoral dissertations. I actually did a search of a database I belong to see. And in the late 20th and into the early 21st century, there are at least, I counted 30 doctoral dissertations in the United States alone that dealt with her. And after she was made a doctor of the church in 2012, there have been a significant number of others. So it certainly has elevated her. So why am I saying this? Why these scholars of the Middle Ages who bring her to light in the late 20th century, we owe them credit for that. But in many ways, I see the church reclaiming her as a great intellect, as a great force of the Middle Ages, to speak for the church. I think that may be part of what was driving, at least in the church in the early 21st century, this cause for her. I think it's fair to say, I was thinking about this the other day when I actually went back to read something that I had not looked at in a very long time of hers, these letters that I mentioned to the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. I'll tell you about him in just a second, because he's an interesting guy too. Why she's writing to him is interesting. But I think it's fair to say you can compare the works of the rediscovery of the works of Hildegard of Bingen to what the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls must have meant to biblical scholars. It's like, oh my gosh, we've got something new. We have something completely new to write about, something completely new to study. And I tell you, this is particularly true in my discipline of history. We're always looking for something new to talk about. Because you think about it, there's only so many different ways you can talk about the past before you've kind of exhausted all of the possibilities. So I think that the whole, all of academia was excited about this kind of rediscovery of her that came about, translated into English and other languages for the first time. So this postmodern viewpoint that we do owe great homage to these people for bringing her back to light. They are the same ones who labeled her feminist, though, and they are the same ones who have published, and I read some of this, I didn't read a lot of it, because quite frankly it's depressing, but they published sort of the presumption that Hildegard's visionary experiences should be interpreted in light of some physical illness that she had, that perhaps she was epileptic, or perhaps, she suffered from some kind of seizures, or there's an explanation, a physical explanation for her mysticism that you would expect to find in academic literature. And again, I think it may partially explain why the church reclaimed her in 2015. Strictly Catholic perspectives of the life of St. Hildegard, and incidentally, she's been a saint a long time. Okay? Now, she became a saint long before we had a formal process for recognizing saints. So pre-15th century, pre-congregation of the causes of saints, she was already universally recognized in the church as a saint. But to go and find strictly Catholic perspectives of her life that highlight her spiritual gifts, that talk about her unique mysticism, her intellectual contributions, any of her miraculous associations with her are quite rare. It's quite rare to find that in Catholic literature, even now 8 years after she was made a doctor. But I want to go back and say this again to highlight something we've touched on the last few weeks. In the Middle Ages in general, and particularly the High Middle Ages where St. Hildegard belongs, the period from between about 1000 to 1300, men were, of course, far more likely to be literate than women. And this is especially true in the era that she lives in. Women, even sometimes in religious communities, were denied an education at this point in time. Even in wealthy families, it was considered a waste for a woman to receive an education. So many social historians have done this, I've estimated this, and I thought you might be curious to know, because we have talked about these women being literate. St. Catherine of Siena in the 14th century, St. Therese of Avila in the 16th century, that was rare even then. And now we're going back further. We're going back to the 11th century. And social historians estimate that out of the total population of Europe, and there's all sorts of markers for how they can estimate this based on library contents and communities that we can measure chronicles from. It's estimated that 10% of men were literate. 10%. And so what you're looking at is, if you think about that, that's 90% of men in the 11th, 12th century would not have been able to read and write, or not have been able to read and write well, okay? 90% of men. So that 10% of men who are literate are those who are they? They're churchmen, right? They're scholars. They're the founders of the first universities, but they're religious. What percentage of women do you think are estimated to have been literate in the High Middle Ages? Maybe 1. Less than 1%. Less than 1%. And here you have Hildegard of Bingen. So I think this poet, musician, artist, writer, philosopher can be forgiven for some crude Latin, right? So yeah, she obviously, it's really a kind of a fascinating anomaly to consider when you think about it. And also, I think, I was so struck by this, but this is something that our world takes so for granted, don't we? The ready accessibility of the printed word today, well, I guess in our case, probably it's the digital word, but the ready accessibility of that, books, I mean, how many you have on your Kindle? right? I got, I don't know, 1,000 books on my Kindle. And I can go home and download a whole bunch more today. And then, you know, a year from now they won't be read. But anyway, I don't know if anybody else does that or not. But we have all of this access, instant access. So we've really lost the perspective of what this meant, what it would have meant to a woman like Hildegard of Bingen in the first place. Books were exceedingly rare, and because they were handmade, they were exceedingly rare, and only the very wealthy in the church owned any at all. So I think it's really interesting to consider that. Now, what worked in her favor, of course, is that her position. Her position. Remember that she was an abbess, which was a prestigious and powerful position within a religious community. Someone who would have had extensive administrative responsibilities. She was the boss. And in this age where you see this great disparity, there's something that I have always found fascinating, and I think you might too. In areas where you have religious communities of men and women that coexist together, like you have a Benedictine monastery and a group of religious living together, men living together, for instance, as Benedictines, women living together as Benedictines, in separate communities, but those communities are linked. You know what I'm saying? In any given area. Studies, really, of records of the Middle Ages going into the modern era show that even in these double communities where a convent was adjacent to or joined with a male monastic community, the superior of both could just as easily have been the woman, the abbess. There seems to have been a great deal of equality at that level of administration, even in the Middle Ages, in these joint religious houses. Something that, again, I think is really, really fascinating. She certainly seems to have enjoyed a lot of prestige and notoriety in the age in which she lived. As I mentioned, she's written to Pope, she's written to St. Bernard, she's engaged in correspondence with the Holy Roman Emperor. And why? Well, Bingen, remember she's German. Okay, so Bingen is just a little tiny little bit to the west of Frankfurt, which is where this area is, and the Holy Roman Emperor at the time that she lived was Frederick I, Frederick Barbarossa. Barbarossa means Redbeard, and he was known for lots of things, and none of them really good. He lived a very scandalous lifestyle. He's been variously described by his biographers as a very cruel man. He was less kindly described as a drunk in most accounts. As a matter of fact, he went on the Third Crusade. He traveled on the Third Crusade in the late 12th century with two other great epic figures of the Middle Ages, Richard Lionheart and Philip II, Philip Augustus, as he called himself. He didn't have any ego problems. Richard Lionheart and Philip Augustus. He goes on crusade with them, and Frederick Barbarossa was intoxicated and fell off of his horse and drowned in a stream in about 5 inches of water. So, anyway, I digress, but the point of that story was so that you would know a little bit about how he's remembered in history. And where she intersects the story is that she attempted to intervene in his life. She didn't even know him, but she'd heard these stories about the scandalous life that he lived. She heard the stories about his personal behavior and conduct. She was concerned about him being an alcoholic, and she tried to intervene. And that's interesting that correspondence much of it has actually survived. So, she wrote over 300 letters to people who either sought her advice, who singled her out as someone they believed could give advice, or she's offering advice unsolicited to people, which is, of course, the case of what happened with the Holy Roman Emperor. But it's interesting to me also that she minimized herself. And I think this is just something that perhaps women of the Middle Ages would have done in order to be taken more seriously. She minimized herself, her intellect, by being quite deferential and actually down on herself in the way that she addressed these letters. In her letter to Pope Eugene III, for instance, this is what she wrote about herself. I am but a poor creature formed from a rib, ignorant of the world, ignorant of philosophy, ignorant of most things. That's how she referred to herself. It's great intellect. But, as I said, I think that's probably, that deference was normative, would have been normative for a woman in the age in which she lived. And the men she corresponded with responded very positively, encouragingly to her, warmly, and she continued writing, leaving us this great newfound trove. And I say newfound, I would say in the last century, her works. So, in addition to these books, these letters, she has dozens of musical compositions. She also wrote from her experience of helping with the medicinal herbs in the garden and the religious community where she lived, that she worked, apparently she was interested in healing people with these, from the herb garden, and she produced something that's kind of a medical manual of the Middle Ages in many ways. So for those of you that are interested in holistic medicine, she's also a great source for that. So these two women, neither one of them I think we would describe as timid, but yet both, I think, very different. St. Hildegard of Bingen enjoyed a long life for the age in which she lived. She died at the age of 81 in the 12th century, when the average lifespan was about, for a woman, was about 40 years. If you made it to 40 years, ladies, you'd done well. She lived to be 81. Quite an accomplishment in and of itself. So, what do all these great figures of the past week, so y'all have been in here 13 weeks, did you know that? 13 weeks. All these great figures of the past 13 weeks have in common. Going back to the very beginning and the apostolic fathers, all the way through the last of these female doctors, either forging or supporting the core doctrines of the faith, okay? Obviously, it is the fathers and male doctors of the church, particularly those early ones, that are going to have the most important role in that. Being a light to others during the time in which they lived and beyond, all of them have that in common. By the model of their lives, by the way that they lived the faith, their own personal witness to the faith, they all have that in common, that they are a light to all of us. The timelessness of their writings, speaking to these eternal and universal truths. So, I want to conclude this by saying to everyone, to those of you that are the faithful remnant who've been coming every week, who are here physically, to those of you who have joined virtually, to those of you that I know are using this as part of your own educational programming at parishes, wherever you are. I want to thank everyone for being part of this, and thank you for coming and participating. I look forward to the opportunity to develop in future, hopefully, more programming like this. And in the meantime, wishing everyone a very blessed fourth week of Advent. Thank you.